Hi, everyone. Let's get started. To begin, I'm sure that many of us on the call are speechless after the events of November 5th. There are myriad ways that we can dissect the election results and a million ways that we can look to the future. Over the next hour, we're going to put on our bifocals using the lens of gender equality and in particular masculinities to both look down at what's just happened, but also to look ahead to where we're going on our work with engaging men and boys on gender equality. To help give us the sense of perspective, I'm delighted to welcome Jackson Katz, who is the founder and CEO of MVP Strategies, and also Gary Barker, who is the founder and CEO of Equimundo. A note about the format of this session: we're going to hear from Jackson and Gary on their take of where we are today and where we're going, and then we're going to open the session up to questions. Please, could you put your questions in the chat as we go along? If you'd like to tell us who you are, we'd be delighted to know more about you. And if your question is directed to either Gary or Jackson in particular, please let us know. So we're going to get going with, I think, sort of election 101. For those of us like myself who are sitting outside of the US, the prevailing narrative about the election is that, frankly, it was white guys who brought Trump and the Republicans back into power. But if you look into the detail, it's not as black and white as that. So Jackson, over to you first to give us a little bit on the 50 shades of gray of who voted for whom and why. You're muted, Jackson, I think.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much, Shereen. It's great to be with you and Gary and all your colleagues at Equimundo, and as well as all the people on this call. And I want to just echo your comments about sort of setting the table a little bit emotionally. I think that a lot of us are feeling a range of disappointment, despair, and real fear. And so while we're going to get to some analysis, I just wanted to acknowledge that I feel this way as well, and I think a lot of people do. I just wanted to say that before getting into some data. Now, I'm just going to give a kind of a general overview and then hone in on the specifics of the quote men's vote in this election, just as a table setter. Rather than some comprehensive pollster or academic take. I don't think that's what I'm about to do. One thing, it's clear that Trump's victory was pretty broad and wide. He won both the popular vote and the electoral college vote, and he won in virtually every category. So we could parse out specific subgroups and have arguments till the cows come home about what the Harris campaign could have done differently or didn't do or anything like that. And it's really not that helpful because the victory that Trump won was bigger than any specific decision during the campaign. I think that's important to say. But I do think it's important to say that men elected Donald Trump. I mean, and white men in specific, even though your point is well taken, Shereen, white men were not alone in electing Donald Trump, but there's no question that the driving force behind Trumpism and right-wing populism more generally in the United States is white men, and that's true in this election. In this election, by the way, I'm using exit poll data that is notoriously at this early stage faulty. So we have to have that caveat that anything we say now could change when subsequent harder data comes in. But and I'm using much of my data here is from the NBC News, exit poll, one of the more well-known ones. Trump beat Harris 55-42 among men, and women went for Harris 53-45. Among white men, Trump beat Harris 60-37, which is a pretty dramatic and strong showing. Although, by the way, that's not inconsistent with a lot of Republican victories over the Democrats in the last 30 years. In other words, the 23-point gap in the white male vote is not extraordinary. It's more normative. there is this really important class divide in the white male vote, as there are in other of the segments of the electorate. So basically, among college-educated white men, Trump beat Harris by only 3 points, 50 to 47, which is the same as Trump beat Joe Biden in 2020. And that's, by the way, pretty notable. In other words, the college-educated white male vote for the last 30 years has been much broader. I mean, the Republicans have beaten the Democrats in the white college-educated male vote by a lot more than 3 points, with the exception of 2020 and now the exception of 2024. But among high school-educated white men, Trump beat Kamala Harris by 40 points, 69 to 29. And that's, by the way, close to and consistent with the way in which the high school educated white male vote has been going for the Democrats vis-a-vis the Republicans in national elections for quite some time. So think about the class divide among the white male vote. It's not a monolith. And by the way, this is also true of the white women's vote. So the white women's vote, which so often people talk about as sort of the focus of what happened. And can I just say, this is an editorial comment? I understand that it's important to talk about the white women's vote, although our focus is more about men and boys. But I think that the conversation about the white women's vote has to take place subordinate to the conversation about the white men's vote, because I don't think it's fair to say the white women's vote is what elected Trump, because it gives a pass to white men. And it's, that's not, to me, it's sexist on its face, even though I'm not saying that it's not something that's worthy of discussion. So the white women's vote, which again, it's a moving target in terms of the actual numbers, but it's something like 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. But there's a significant class divide in the white women's vote. So college-educated white women voted 57 to 41, 16 points for Kamala Harris. So the white college-educated women voted overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris, but high school-educated white women voted for Donald Trump by 63 to 35%. So there's a significant class divide in the high school-educated white women's vote, just as there is in the men's vote, the white men's vote. And then moving on to a couple other categories, and then I'll stop and defer to Gary, because again, there's so much data. Trump did make gains among men of color, especially Latino men. Latino men supported Donald Trump, voted for Donald Trump by 55 to 43%, which is pretty extraordinary. Latinas voted for Kamala Harris by 60 to 38. So in other words, within the Latina vote, there was a significant and dramatic gender gap that has to be acknowledged. So it wasn't Latinos, it wasn't Latinas that voted for Trump. It was Latino men voted for Trump, Latinas voted for Harris. We can talk about why that is. And then in the black male vote, there was a slight increase over the 2020 election, but there's a significant gender gap in the black vote because black women overwhelmingly voted for Kamala Harris, 91% to 7, whereas black men voted for Harris, 77 to 21. So there's an incredibly important gender gap within these groups of communities of color, including communities that supported Kamala Harris. There's a significant gender gap that has to be accounted for. Why do more black men, by a strong majority, not just a majority, by quite a bit, voted for, voted less for Kamala Harris than did black women? And then finally, the young person's vote. Now, I'm involved with I'm one of the co-founders of the Young Men Research Initiative. I'm not speaking for my colleagues. I'm speaking in context of myself, but I'm just saying one of the things we've been looking at since the beginning of 2024 is the young people's vote, especially the young men's vote in the 18 to 29-year-old category specifically. And there's some challenging numbers coming out of that demographic. And I'll just give you a couple of highlights. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, Harris did beat Trump, which is expected, by the way. And if it wasn't, then it would be just a disaster, even more of a disaster for some of us than it was. It was about 54 to 43. In other words, the overall 18 to 29-year-old vote went for Harris. But if you go into the gender breakdown of the 18 to 29-year-olds, 18 to 29-year-old women voted 61 to 37 for Kamala Harris, which is a pretty dramatic victory, although not as big a victory as Joe Biden won in 2020. So even Kamala Harris lost some support among women in the 18 to 29-year-old category in comparison to Joe Biden in 2020. So again, 61-37 for 18 to 29-year-old women for Harris, but from 18 to 29-year-old men, they went for Trump 49 to 47, which means that there's a dramatic gender gap in the 18 to 29-year-old group. And I know Gary and the State of American Men in 2023 that Equimundo put out, and a lot of other research and activism that Equimundo has been doing, as well as the Young Men Research Initiative, has been really sort of flagging and trying, it's kind of raising a red flag. It's like we have to be paying more attention to young men, because young men and young women are diverging dramatically. And there are racial and ethnic subcategories within that. I'm not going to get into them at the moment, but there are important subcategories. But the overall picture is that young women are moving left and young men are moving right. Last thing, when I say moving right, it doesn't mean on issues or ideology or beliefs. Because a lot of young men, if you look at the data, a lot of young men, in fact, strong majorities of young men support a whole range of progressive positions on issues, from climate crisis policy to abortion rights to labor union support to gun safety regulation. In other words, young men on issues are much more progressive than they are in terms of voting choices at the presidential level. And I think this is my editorial comment. This is all about narrative, story, and identity. It's not about policy or issues. And that's part of the terrain that the right has been wildly successful at with young voters, especially in this case, young male voters, is creating a narrative that a lot of young men, including young white men, but not exclusively, can get behind. And I think we're playing catch up at this point, and it's an incredibly important sector of the electorate to focus on. So hopefully that'll give some general picture before we move into the discussion, and I'll turn it over to yourself and to Gary. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jackson. That's a really great overview of where we are, and also some suggestions of where we're heading. Gary, I want to turn to you. So, the result is both shocking, but also, as Jackson pointed out, sort of understandable, given the data and the research that Equimundo and others have been doing. And in particular, there's an intersecting issue here about economy. I mean, my understanding is also when people voted for Trump, they voted for someone who they thought was stronger on the economy. Mm. And as Gary, as the work that you and I have done in the Middle East has shown, and also your work on elsewhere in the world, this idea of homo economicus, I am a man because I provide, is really central to a lot of the thinking and a lot of the identity of men. So can you speak to a little bit about what the data has been showing us and whether it shows us a path ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Shereen and Jackson. Thanks for your comments. I start by we've been writing about and thinking with some of our staff and some co-researchers about this idea of men's perception of economic precarity. And I want to preface by even saying that it feels even strange to have to talk about men's economic precarity in a world, in a country where women make 84% of what men do. If you're an Hispanic woman, that's 65% of what a white man makes. If you're a Black woman, that's 70% of what a white man makes. In a country where the median white household has 6 times the wealth of the average Black family, it does feel bizarre to have to talk about, if not just truly unfair, to be talking about men and their sense of economic precarity. But that is what I think in large part was one of the factors behind how Trump and others were able to speak to men, and we on the left have not been able to. We have to understand that in those big averages that I just shared, lots of men, particularly low-income men with less than college education, for example, lots of men feel the sense that my economic future is unstable. Some men, that is real. They can look back at what their fathers have done and grandfathers have done, and they won't achieve that. Others, it's a question of perception, and that's where narrative and identity come in here. But I think we've got a big challenge of thinking about this sense of our futures are unstable. And that's not an unreasonable thing to think when parts of the country are on fire, parts of the country are still underwater from hurricanes, when we have more active conflicts in the world than we have had since World War II. It is reasonable to think, like, I feel really unsure. What we, I think, have not been able to do is to talk about how do we see your insecurity, and we're okay to see your insecurity even though you represent a demographic that has had power and privilege. And I think that's a huge part of our challenge. The other part that I think is part of that economic precarity and insecurity, and Shereen, you touched on it, is this idea of how men define what it means to be men and to be humans. Progressive, not progressive, across political spectrums, across the world, the kind of number one way men define their sense of who they are as men is by being providers. That on its face value is not a bad thing, particularly for men who can say, I also see that women can do that as well, or maybe better than I can. But the sense of kind of baked in insecurity and precarity with American men, I think is worth talking about for a moment. Back in the 60s, we might say the heyday of boomer white manhood, sociologist Irving Goffman said back then that men, even those who supposedly met all the requisites for being true men, felt a deep sense of insecurity. It's built in to this idea that you can never achieve enough. You can never have enough money, enough of those things that supposedly make you men. Susan Faluti's book in '99, Stiffed, it was like a preview for what we're looking at now of men's feeling that we lost out compared to women and we're being passed by and there's not really a platform for us. Michael Kimmel's work on aggrieved entitlement, of looking at kind of it with angry white men, of kind of men feeling like the world passed them by, and then jump into 2024 when we've got all this stuff sort of, fed steroids on the manosphere. That sense of insecurity in men is being fed on by right-wing politicians, and we saw what happened. So I think our question has to be, how do we step in and say, we see that sense of precarity. We don't want to give more, pour more gasoline on that fire, but we do need to in some way acknowledge that you feel disconnected, not seen, and you feel that deep sense of this, kind of hyper-capitalist version of manhood that precarity is built into, that we see it and we talk about it. Obviously, those words I'm using are not going to make it with young men out there. And that's another part that we have to work at. But I think we as a field have got to say, we're going to get men to our side when we understand how there's this deep hole in their sense of who they are and a deep sense of insecurity that goes against what we believe in because we see the privilege and power that's there as well. But we've got to step into that with deep compassion. So I absolutely agree with Jackson that there's a point there around our facts are not going to do it, right? Of showing that inequality. How do we step in and we capture part of the narrative that says, I see your insecurity. If not, I think we end up where Bernie Sanders said, which is, the working class, the Democratic Party abandoned the working class and the working class abandoned the Democratic Party. I think we've got to step in there and see working class men are really worried. There's a lot of upper income men who are being very exploitative of that worry. We've got to step in and say, we see your worry. We can call you in to a platform that promises equality and better life for all. I'll just add to say it's not only about doing better about our social welfare policies, because Western Europe is also faring poorly on all this. I was just in Iceland at the Women Political Leaders Forum. Women political leaders and men political leaders from Western Europe, countries that have far better welfare systems than we have, better vocational training for young men, better economic opportunities overall for some young men, they're also seeing the same move. So it's also not just a real economic precarity, it's also just how the right wing is capturing that fear and weaponizing it, monetizing it, and winning elections with it. You're on mute, Shereen.
Yes. I was going to say, thanks for all that, Gary. And what's really interesting is this concept of American exceptionalism, I think, is well and truly blown out of the water now, because the research that Equimundo and others have done, and my own experiences in the Middle East and North Africa, are speaking to this sort of sense of real male insecurity at a world that is changing, that they don't seem to be able to keep up with. And Jackson, to your point, in the Middle East and North Africa, we see exactly the same thing, that we see women, young women, going in one direction, looking to the future of equality and economic and social and political engagement, and young men heading in another direction. So sadly, a global phenomenon. Let's talk a little bit about what both Gary and Jackson have picked up upon, which is the sense of men's purpose, and how that was really fed very effectively by the Republicans this time round. Jackson, do you want to speak to a little bit about how the Republicans did that and what those on the left can do to provide an alternative narrative?
Sure. Well, I mean, some of this is so basic, right? And Gary, Gary quoted, Goffman from the 60s. I mean, those of us who've been doing pro-feminist men's work, if you will, since the 1970s, have been talking about the ways in which ideologies about manhood, like in particular, the protector and the provider are the two sort of central pillars of masculine identity, right? So you protect your family and you provide for your family and your community more broadly. And Trump, in his crude way, speaks to both of those. I just want to say something about the protector piece, because the protector piece often gets left out of the narrative about Trumpism and it's particularly the United States. Now, I know that there's a gun culture in the United States that is, somewhat unique in the rest of the world, but I'm speaking about the United States now. To me, the gun narrative is all about masculinity. In other words, the reason why we've had such a challenge with getting, sane gun policy is because the gun is the instrument of men's ability to, again, I'm speaking on a sort of a cultural analysis level. The gun is the instrument whereby men can fulfill their primary role as protector. And a lot of men see the idea of taking the gun away from them, if you will, or restricting their access to guns as a way of restricting their ability to be men in the fundamental way that they understand they need to be protectors of their family. So it's deeply rooted. There's no way to talk about gun policy in the United States without talking about masculinity. And yet mainstream discussion doesn't even mention masculinity, which is crazy to me, absolutely crazy. But Trump, when he talks about protection, the discussion about immigration, so much of that taps into this notion of men as protector, and especially white men as protector of white womanhood in the face of dark-skinned men's threat to white womanhood, which is a very deep trope in American history and in other parts of the world too. It's not just exclusive to the United States, but certainly the United States. I mean, the idea that in the colonial period, in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, this was a very powerful narrative that white men needed to protect white women from dark-skinned men who will do them harm. Trump just absolutely calls that out. I mean, he just says it. He says it blatantly. And people, some of us can look at that and say, oh my God, this is such, manipulative propaganda, but it still works in the 21st century. It still works to mobilize fear. And by the way, he mobilizes women's fear and men's sense of themselves as protector at the same time, especially white. It's coded white, of course, to white men and white women. So that's one piece of it. So purpose, men's purpose, to your question of being protector is embodied in that Trumpian narrative and the gun culture narrative and the gun rights narrative. That's one piece. And then the provider piece, the sense of providing for your family. And Gary's made that point, I think, very, very well. But I have to say, I think it's important to say that when people say they vote on, quote, the economy, what does that mean? It's like people have wildly different understandings of how the economy works, what the relationship is between policy and economics. What does the president have to do with the price of eggs? People don't know, generally speaking, are very illiterate on political economy generally, but certainly on the role of the state in intervening in the economy. So I think we have to talk about narrative again. We have to talk about what is the story that Trump is telling? What is the story that the Republicans and the right is telling about the economy, not the economy? And I think a lot of young men who, yes, are feeling precarious, many of them, and they do hear this narrative that Trump is better, better on jobs. Trump is better on black unemployment, which is all of this. By the way, it's not even true. A lot of this is just Trump just says things. We all know this. He just says things. And you might say, well, that the data doesn't show that. The data actually shows that Biden has been better for black unemployment. Biden has been better for communities of color in many ways. But if you don't tell that story, if you don't have people talking about it and narrating it at the level that Trump and his surrogates do, then what does it matter? And by the way, we also know, I just want to say, it's important to say, I think, and maybe we'll get to this even subsequently, in the media ecosphere that a lot of these young men in particular are living, they're not reading think pieces in the Atlantic. They're not taking seminars in economic policy and macroeconomic factors that relate to the young men's job possibilities. They're listening to Joe Rogan. They're listening to a Ben Shapiro clip on social media. They're listening to Charlie Kirk's sort of demagogic statements in a speech, and that gets pushed around in social media, and people talk about it and they shake their heads. And if we're not engaged in that discourse, and if we don't understand that the way that they're absorbing some of their understanding of how the economy works and what is the role of the state, what is the role of the government, what is the direct relationship between your voting choices and the outcomes that you get in terms of policy, we've lost the struggle. So I would say purpose is really important, and I think that we have to create a narrative that's better, that speaks to young men's sense of themselves as wanting to be somebody that makes a difference in a positive way. And if the whole narrative is the deficit narrative about toxicity, about it's time to push aside what men have, especially white men, have been on center stage for too long. If we don't counteract that in some way and give them a positive narrative to hang on to, we're going to get what we just got, which is Donald Trump reelected.
Wow, thanks for all that. And you're making the very strong point that it's the message, but it's also the medium that is influencing young men's and men's direction in general. We've got some great questions coming in. So rather than delay this, I'm going to actually turn to some of the questions because they're germane to the points that you've just made, and we'll come back into the panel discussion. So directly to your point, I mean, both of you, Jackson and Gary, have spoken to what we shouldn't be doing on the left, the messages that we shouldn't be giving. But the question that's come through is, what would you say is the narrative that progressives do need in order to capture the attention of young men? Some thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, if that, the pollster who comes up with that will, win full-time employment with the Democratic National Committee. I think maybe I would unpack that question a little bit and step into what do we see young men gravitating to online, and maybe we can pull out from there, young men and adult men. So, if you step into the kind of the 5-6 things that young men are looking for in the space called the manosphere, the space called online lives, where young men told us in our survey, and a lot of adult men as well, that they find that more interesting than their offline lives. What are they looking for? Love comes in there. So the whole, how to find somebody that I love and want to be in a partnership with. The looks thing comes in there, which I think says a lot about men's sense of insecurity. I want to be seen. I want to be, well built in my suit. There's a lot of insecurity with men about that. There's a lot of stuff that just sort of fun and connection, finding somebody that is like me and I can connect with, given how socially isolated young men feel in particular. Livelihoods is in that top 5. And among older men, how to be good fathers and kind of how to do, concrete hands-on things I need to do to be that provider and protector. That cluster of things is pretty positive for the most part. Like, we can find what worries you and how we step in and support you. So I do think we've got to look and say, I know that there's stuff going on, that your well-being is something we can talk about. Young men's sense of social isolation, the 40% who told us they thought about suicide in the past 2 weeks, that is not much different from young women. The difference is that young men usually don't seek help. So how do we step in and say, we see you in your anguish, and that is okay for us to say that. We see that you're looking for ways to be decent humans in the world, rather than saying, we think you're either our side or the other side. What are the things that we think could give purpose? We've stepped a lot into the conversation around men and caregiving and men as fathers. 60% of adult men in the US are biological fathers. That's a huge hook to engage men on that. Of course, we saw the great stuff with Tim Walz. Unfortunately, the Harris campaign had really little time to build on that. Doug Imhoff, has done fantastic work on that as well. We found there, and Jackson touched on this, men, Republican white fathers want paid leave. They want subsidized childcare. They want a living wage as much as Democratic voting mothers of color, right? So I think there's something we can step into around the issue of caregiving. I think we've got to look at boys in education. There's a lot to step into there about saying parents are very concerned about their sons and lots of sons are not doing too well in school. How do we talk about what's happening there? And we can do so without that being a zero-sum game. And I think the livelihood question, we've got to be able to step in, not just citing our, Jackson, all that you said of all that we've got data showing that actually, Democrats are better when it comes to this. That data is not going to do it if we're not seen as being empathetic to your sense of insecurity. And I think that's where we missed woefully, that we see you, we understand it. And I guess I'd add to that last is I think we need something about a bigger public conversation about what healthy, good, connected manhood is about. I say that as a girl dad, right? It was somewhat easy in the 2000s when she was, a child and becoming a teenager to point to all the things in the world that said girls could be, play princess in the morning and astronaut in the afternoon, and, do cool stuff on the sports field, and, write poetry, and all those things could be considered empowered girlhood and empowered, womanhood. And I don't think we've had a similar conversation about the diversity of ways and the healthy ways that boys can be better connected, loving humans, and also, have some fun, kicking it on the sports field in ways that are healthy and connected and human. So I think we've got to have a bigger public conversation about healthy manhood. I know that we've kind of stayed away from that because it feels so, we feel it explodes in our face when we talk about it, but I think we can. Jackson, I'm inspired by you and lots of folks who are on here who do these conversations about healthy manhood. I think we need to do kind of just a better branding and marketing of it, if I may use those words.
Jackson, just to pick up on Gary's point, and we're not really in a place of healthy manhood right now. If you're looking at what is it, Your Body, My Choice, and all the vitriol that's coming out now in social media. You talked, I think, in your Ms. piece about trying to pull young men back from the abyss. It seems to me as if many of them with this election have plunged right in. So what's your take on how we build back out of that?
Yeah, thank you. Again, there's so many pieces to this, and let's be clear. This election will be studied by historians, political scientists, social psychologists, feminist theorists, and many others for decades and decades, right? This is a really important election. And so all these pieces, I know it's important that we get it on the table, if you will, just a week after the election, but this is the beginning of a conversation rather than anything like the termination of it. I think we have our work cut out for us. I think in a big way. I think one of the things that's important to acknowledge, and I think partly, Shereen, you just brought it into the conversation, and I'll add to it. Donald Trump is an adjudicated rapist. Donald Trump is a misogynist man who has made numerous incredibly overtly misogynist statements, including recently, not just in his past, but even against Kamala Harris, outrageously misogynist and racist statements towards Kamala Harris in public, normalizing misogyny at a level I don't know that we've seen certainly from a political leader ever in the United States. In addition to the fact that he has, 24 plus women with credible sexual assault and sexual harassment allegations against him. That's part of the calamity of what just happened, is that Donald Trump was in full view of the world, was reelected, and he got the votes of a very significant percentage of men, even in spite of, some people would argue, because of, I don't need to go there and just say, in spite of the fact that he has an incredible record of disrespect and abuse towards women. So those of us who do gender violence prevention work, this is a really, really big setback, because part of the argument that we make to men and young men is that if you treat women with disrespect, you should not get the respect of your friends and your peers. You should not get the encouragement and support of your friends and teammates and classmates. That shows that you have deep problems, and it's behavior that's not acceptable. And yet millions of people went, wide-eyed and voted for Donald Trump, even though that's part of his record. So that's an uphill challenge, but I think it's important to say that out loud, because that was a major setback. But I don't think that these men are lost completely to progressive and pro-feminist politics. In fact, one of the things that I've been saying for years in my lectures and in my writing is that the men's health movement, in other words, thinking about men's health, the emotional, physical, sexual, mental health, the steps that we've made, globally, certainly, here we are in, Movember, but certainly even in the United States, the move we've made, the sort of normalization or increasing acceptance of talking about men's vulnerability, especially around our health. The men's health movement is a direct outgrowth of the feminist-led women's health movement. The women's health movement, which one of the formative events was the 1972 publication of Our Bodies, Ourselves, which inaugurated a whole new era of looking critically at how gender intersects with and affects both individuals' health, but also systemic responses to health issues. The men's health movement is a direct outgrowth of the feminist-led women's health movement. And so, in other words, the feminist women are the ones who created the space for a broader discussion about men's, improving men's health. But when's the last time you heard anybody say that publicly? You'll hear people say, and you'll hear the men's rights people say all the time, well, women have had their movement. What about men? What about men's needs? As if the two aren't connected, and as if feminist women didn't create both the intellectual and cultural space to have this more thoughtful conversation about men. So I think when we start talking to men about this and start making these kind of connections and say, you know what, feminism isn't your antagonist. Feminism is actually giving you a path forward, and it's not anti-male. That's such simplistic and cartoonish to think that. But that's the mainstream. Last point, if you look at I know I talk fast. So, I'm from Boston. That's my excuse. I don't know if it works as an excuse, but there it is. But in the online manosphere, which has now become completely normalized. In other words, we can't even talk about it as some sort of, alley down some, back alley. It's like become much more mainstream. You have the president of the United States, literally the president-elect of the United States is a manosphere figure. You know what I mean? How can we say this as a sort of a subculture that's marginalized? It's not. It's become much more mainstream. But in the manosphere, the misogynist manosphere, people like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, and others routinely mock and ridicule men who are supportive of feminist gains and who stand with women as their partners and allies in this work. They constantly mock and ridicule us. And so what the message is to men and young men is that if you have sensibilities, both intellectual or personal, that are supportive of women in your peer culture or in the larger society, you got to kind of keep that to yourself, because that's seen as completely unmasculine. You're just a virtue signaler. You're a beta male. You're a soy boy. You're a cuck, and all this kind of stuff. And someone like me or Gary, some of our members of our generation, you can just brush that off and say this is ridiculous, and it doesn't really, it's not going to stop us from speaking out or doing our work. But for young guys, 15-year-old guys, 23-year-old guys, 30-year-old guys who are living both online and in brick and mortar spaces with their peer culture, if you don't make it acceptable to talk openly about supporting women's aspirations, supporting gender justice, and how gender justice is not going to harm men. In fact, you could say that in many ways, men's lives will improve, whether it's the care economy, as Gary and you pointed out, and as Equimundo has been so powerful, the fatherhood narrative about being more emotionally present as fathers, or any number of other things. We have to get into that conversation with these young men. And by the way, one of the ways to do that is we need trusted messengers. We need men who are willing to say these things and publicly talk about it and destigmatize the space of pro-feminist masculinity. And we haven't done that successfully enough yet. And by the way, that accounts for some of the class differences in the Trump vote. Because as I said right at the beginning, men with a college education are only 3% down. In other words, they voted for Trump only 3% over Kamala Harris, whereas high school educated, in this case, white men voted for Trump 40%. So there's a degree to which the college-educated men have access to some of that narrative that some of those high school educated men don't. That might be through college courses. It might be through who their peers are in the workplace, the kind of conversations they take place in, the media they consume. But we have to always keep in mind that the class, as I said right at the beginning, the class dimension to this, we can't just make broad statements about men without complicating it by some of those class, race, and ethnicity subcategories.
Wow, a lot in a very little time, Jackson. Thank you. Plenty of food for thought there. I'm going through the excellent questions that thank you so much to everyone in this webinar. They're really fantastic, and there's a wealth of choice here. There's just picking up on one of the excellent questions. I'm interested in the role of community building around the opposite messages, inclusion, male empowerment, and care roles, etc. How can we help to build offline communities that recognize real issues of loneliness and isolation amongst men? How do we redirect men to these healthy spaces? Gary?
Yeah, I think that's such a key question, right? As we saw, our data set from 2023, young men ages 18 to 25 said, a third of them didn't see anyone outside their home on a weekly basis. The number of hours spent online, online communities don't fill us with a sense of connection and community that I think also helped to reduce the kind of anger that Trump and the Trump campaign so inspired. We've been partnering with groups like Diverting Hate. We're also partnering with Futures Without Violence and some other groups to say, can we use the online spaces to invite you off? There is a kind of, unsung infrastructure, if you want to call it that, of lots of groups around the country doing, face-to-face work with men. It's often really difficult to recruit them and get them there, but we can list Mankind, City Dads, lots of others, including some that are here on this webinar. How can we use the online spaces to help invite you off so that we're, even some dating apps, and our colleagues, Caroline Hayes, who leads our conversations and research on this, looking at ways that we can engage some dating apps that are also realizing folks are reaching sometimes a saturation of like, this doesn't fill it for me. How can we do this elsewhere? Engaging some influencers and moderators who already believe that, they're not going to live and make a living if those who follow them are causing all kinds of harm, and including self-harm. So I do think one is to step into that space, understand the online lives of men, and find ways that we can help invite you off. I think we're going to have to look at spaces that we might find politically not always completely aligned with us. How do we find ways that some, church groups are getting some guys offline, and they're now more frequented than they are by young women? Are there some of those that are more centrist or progressive that we could say, we see that you're doing a good function by helping men find ways that they're connected? So I do think we've got to do that. I think we got to do a lot of work with parents. I think we got to do work with teachers, so they feel equipped with having these conversations. So it's not a question of panic. I also think we need to take a hard look at the online lives and say, it's not all bad. There's an amazing new documentary that just came out on Netflix, who I'm going to remember the name, but it came out of Norway, of a young man who passed away. His parents thought he was completely disconnected, and at his funeral, this whole group of people come from different parts of the world because he had created this healthy community on World of Warcraft. So I, in talking to some young men in a couple of schools here in DC, they'll say, we know that you look at it and you think that we're doing all this harmful stuff online, but I connect up every day, 5 o'clock with my guys. We're playing Fortnite or we're playing X or Y, and we're unloading and talking about the world and what's happening with us. So I think we have to look at online lives in a more open way. And I think we got to be really creative about how we help young men come offline. And I think we've got to step in some non-judgmental ways that try to listen to ways they're finding connection, but ways that we perhaps have ignored because they don't look like our classic gender empowerment, gender reflective spaces. So yeah, I take that as a big challenge for us to look in there, to find purpose, to invite off. I do think there's some groups like Movember that are trying this as well, to acknowledge, and Jackson, you said this very eloquently about, men's mental health. So let's step into that and acknowledge there is a crisis of connection and loneliness that's out there. Niobe Way's recent book, Rebels with a Cause, and her previous book about boys and what's baked into boys' friendships about the homophobia, that don't get too close, don't be vulnerable. Again, we've got to step in there with deep compassion. And I think if we step into those spaces, it doesn't take very long. I've done this, and I know Jackson does as well, with some corporate execs. A few minutes into the conversation, if it's not, you've got power, you're hoarding it, you're sitting on it. But if I start with how's it going for you? Who do you care for? Who do you care about? Who cares about you? There's a different conversation that we get in terms of opening men up. So I will channel Esta Solar, our partner at Futures Without Violence, who says we need to do a bit less indicting of men and a lot more inviting of men.
Thanks, Gary. Jackson, your thoughts on online to offline?
Well, some of this is, a generational shift that's happening. I mean, we're living through the digital revolution, which is in many ways has an impact as great as the introduction of electricity in the late 19th century. And we're only at the beginning. And I mean, even in this conversation, I mean, myself, I'll just speak, for myself, and Gary and I are, generational, cohort, but in our lifetime, I mean, when I talk to my son, I have a 23-year-old son, it's like, it's a completely different world that he lives in. And the sort of the narratives and the norms and where he gets his information and the role of technology in his life is just so radically different. And so I think one of the challenges for those of us who are a little more, shall we say, long in the tooth and have a little, have a little more, have more, mild on the old jalopy, we have to figure out how to, help transition to this new world, because the new world is not going back. We're not going back, right? I mean, the online spaces and the way that young people are interacting with technology and how that shapes notions of community and connection, that's not going back to the old days, And so everything has to be understood within the context of this larger frame, this larger historical shift. And it can be terrifying because it's so radical, the shifts. I mean, AI, not that we can go into this now, but AI, are you kidding me? It's like how people, one of the big challenges, I think, is in terms of the information economy, is that because there are so many sources of information that are so easily accessible with the click of you're on your phone. How do you judge what is credible and what is non-credible information? And so while it does give the voice to more progressive and feminist narratives, because it's not gatekeeping, there's the gatekeeping by the sort of corporate media is no longer the exclusive, has exclusive power over that narrative, over those narratives. The flip side is that all kinds of idiocy and all kinds of disinformation and misinformation and all kinds of voices can get lifted up that historically would have been marginalized. But now, if they're charismatic, like the Nick Fuentes of the world, I mean, he says that statement about, my body, your body, my choice. And it's gotten, now over 100 million, views and engagements. And it was a trollish statement. It was an incredibly misogynist statement, but yet Nick Fuentes, a generation or two ago, no one would have heard of him, but now he's a global celebrity. And how do we navigate that space? And how do those of us who aren't coming out of growing up with that digital, universe, how do we help them? Because they're obviously the cliche is they're the future. That's one of our challenges, I think, and one of my challenges. Just one other thing I think it's important to get at least on the table, not to do it full justice, but the violence of right-wing sort of movements like in the United States is incredibly powerful. And the linkage between violent masculinity and violence. In other words, you can't talk about violence without talking about masculinity, because the overwhelming majority of violence in the world is done by men, both as individuals and as actors of states that are dominated by men. So we have to talk about that. But the challenge when it comes to violence is that the fear that violent retribution, the potential retribution instills in people, a lot of people are paralyzed by that fear. And for example, a lot of men and young men who know that if they start speaking out on these matters, make themselves vulnerable to potential violence, whether that's online in the spaces that people, connect with each other, or in other words, abusive behavior can happen in cyberspace as well. but also even on the ground. And I think it's important that we say going forward, even right now, Donald Trump hasn't even taken office and lots of people are afraid and they're fearful. And so I think we have to talk openly about those fears. And those of us who are leaders in the work have to be, at the forefront of talking about that. But I think we need to acknowledge that a lot of people are afraid. A lot of women are afraid because of the retribution and the potential violence of if they speak up, if they're overtly feminist in this moment. But I think also a lot of men are policed into conformist silence, not because they agree with the behavior, but because they're also afraid. And I think we have to acknowledge that and say that, okay, we appreciate and see that and hear that, but we can't let our fear of violence paralyze us from doing the right thing.
Thank you, Jackson, for all that. And again, I've noticed this, and it's with great dismay, because coming from the Middle East and North Africa, this is how we roll, right? I mean, the fear, the sense of impending doom, the retribution could come at any moment, and you don't know that you've crossed the red line until you're over it, because it's a moving target. It's really distressing to hear the same sort of language now coming out from our friends in America. And I'm looking at our webinar chat, and you're talking about the online community. Thank you to everyone on this webinar for your wonderful comments and for your willingness to support and engage with each other. This is exactly the world we're trying to build, online and offline as well. I'm going to just speak to the bigger world now. And of course, the ascendancy of Trump and the Republicans has, profound implications for the US, but it also has real import for the rest of the world as well. And in particular, if you're looking at the direction that foreign policy may take and the implications that may have for work on gender equality and positive masculinities elsewhere in the world. Gary, can you just talk a little bit about how this work is going to continue given the direction of one of the world's leaders in this space?
Ooh, yeah. How long do we have to talk about that? And this has been 10 days. So, much more to do. I found, some solace in being in Iceland at the forum they do annually with women political leaders. And we have a woman president of Iceland, and Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, was also there. And, 30% of parliamentarians in the world are women. We need to get to the 50%, but that 30%, there's lots of lessons of how we bring men to vote for women in many countries in the world, and to vote for progressive women, not just voting for any woman politician, but voting for progressive women. All of them reinforce the fact that there are good, supportive men out there, that we've got to be careful not to kind of overplay in this particular moment in the world, let's not let it speak for all parts of the world. And I think, Jackson, you touched on this earlier, which is the 70% of young men in the US who think that abortion should be legal in most circumstances, not that different from what young women think. The number of men that we know from our data that support care policies, the advances on LGBT plus, I think LGB on the T, we've got a lot of work to go to do still, but there have been changes that we've got to embrace and step into. All is not lost. And I also step into thinking about and listening to young men. And that's what we're going to be doing a lot of, is a lot of listening before we step in with the next round. We're about to step in with a global survey, Shereen, that builds off the previous one that we did, to do a lot of listening. How is this sense of social, economic precarity, how are online lives shaping manhood, and how can we step in? But I do think we've got to step in with a big belief, and I do this inspired by the women leaders who have been doing this for years, is that resistance is not futile. There is so much that we can do in this space. And I do believe that a lot of the young men that we're talking about who may click on that they listen to Fuentes or any of the other, fill in the, white supremacists and misogynists online, they don't necessarily believe all of it. And in fact, they don't believe all of it. There's a part of the medium that makes trolling just seem like the thing you do, that doesn't necessarily reflect what they live in real life. And so I think we've got to step in with that belief. There is a well of resistance. There's an ability to think critically about what you're seeing there. And there's a lot of good in men that I think we can get caught up in just one single story that Trump won. So whether we look at, the states that voted for referenda to hold abortion rights in place, or the number of folks who believe in paid leave that's happening now in 12 of our states, et cetera. We can make a list of places where we've got to say, we lost the battle last week, but we haven't lost, I don't like to use that language. We have not lost this cause. And I think, to really, really lean into the resistance that's there. And I believe that a lot of it lives in the hearts of young men, as well as the hearts of young women and non-binary individuals as well. So I have to end on that to get through to the next day and to say, this is what we're going to step into next, is by believing in that resistance.
Indeed. And I'm just going to pick up a point that one of our colleagues on this webinar has put out, and food for thought for our next the next installment of this conversation. As Jackson said, this is just the point of departure, not the final word. I would love to have heard a young man's perspective on this call as well, just to hear directly from the source. I understand that young men could not and perhaps not stand out for the majority. It would just be nice to hear directly from their perspectives. So again, food for thought. Jackson, over to you. We've heard from Gary, and as usual, Gary, your optimism in the face of in the face of adversity is always very heartwarming and encouraging. But Jackson, fast forward to 2028. What world do you see for you and your son?
Well, thank you, Shereen. I mean, let's put it this way. It is also important, building on what Gary just said, it's also important to acknowledge that while Trump did win a decisive victory, it's a very divided country electorally. It's not, in other words, the idea that somehow Trumpism or Trumpist populism, right-wing populism is the dominant narrative in the United States. I don't believe that. And so I think we have to take stock. We have to look around and figure out how we can do better, obviously, because this is not an acceptable status quo. But I don't think we have to be completely despairing. So I think we have to organize. I mean, it's basic. And then not even 2028 at this point. It's 2026, because if we get people, passionate and emboldened and fighting back, if you will, I think we can put a big dent into the damage that Trumpism will do over the next few years. And then 2028 will be a completely different landscape. And by the way, Donald Trump is a protean figure. I mean, for all that I and many others, feel about him, and none of it's positive, he has an enormous sort of footprint in the psychological footprint in people's psyches and in narratives. And he's an incredible actor for this sort of generation, if you will. And he's had an incredible impact. And I think most of it has been overwhelmingly negative. But once he passes from the scene, it'll be a totally different landscape. So I say there is reason for optimism. And last thing I'll say is I think we have to challenge the zero-sum thinking that especially when working with men and young men, that when women gain, men lose. And I think this is totally wrong. And many of us who have been doing this work, Gary, myself, and our generation, and others, we've been always understanding that feminism has given us an insight into the way that the world works that is helpful to everybody, not just women. And even though that's important, that it's important to women and girls, obviously, it's much bigger than that. And I think we need to be able to tell the story to men and young men that supporting women and supporting women political candidates and supporting women's aspirations is not taking something away from you. It's actually helping you to be a better and a wholer human being. And if we can make that case, I'm not saying we're going to convince the Nick Fuentes of the world, but if we can make that case, I think a lot of men can hear it in a positive way. And so I think calling them in to being better and to rising to the occasion and saying, we need you to be part of this change that has to happen. There's all these crises that are happening all over the world. They're going to continue to happen. And we need you to be part of the struggle for justice and fairness and all these positive things. Because I think a lot of men, while they might be put off by and defensive in the face of you better stop doing these horrible, toxic things, I think a lot of those same men, if you present it to them in the spirit of we need you to achieve these incredibly important goals, I think a lot of those men can hear it in a much more constructive way.
Well, on that highly positive, optimistic, and constructive note, we'll call it a day on this conversation. Thank you so much to Gary and to Jackson for sharing their views. And again, thank you to all of you who are in attendance and your wonderful contributions in the chat. Hopefully there'll be a way to capture those and to follow up on those. So we look forward to seeing you at the next Equimundo webinar, which I'm sure won't be long. And enjoy the rest of your day, and courage to us all.
Thanks, Shereen, and thanks everyone for being in community with us for an hour on this. I think that's the only way we're going to make it forward. So thanks for that. Thank you, Shereen.
Thanks, Shereen.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jackson.